I don't know, but I suspect that if you're a regular theatre goer in Scotland, Linda McLean will be a prized name for you. She's written plays for approaching a quarter of a century, and they've been produced by Scotland's most important theatres and companies, from 784 to Oran Moor, from the Royal Lyceum to the Traverse. She's run the Playwrights Studio, which is their brilliant resource for playwrights in Scotland. She was a creative fellow at Edinburgh University. I suspect that if you're a regular theatre goer in England, Linda McLean may be quite unknown to you. Her one wholly original play to have been performed in London, as far as I know, was her extraordinary play Riddance, which played at the Lyric Hammersmith in 1999, over 20 years ago. And let me say, London, we are missing out. We're missing out on one of the most extraordinary, brilliant, sophisticated, daring playwrights in Britain. Linda McLean, I think, deserves to be spoken of in the same breath as Sarah Kane and Carol Churchill, and I don't say that lightly. She's one of the most exciting playwrights I know, and she's also one of the most exciting feminist playwrights I know. Riddance, I mentioned, is an early play, but it's kind of characteristic in concentrating on a tightly focused group of people haunted by the past, haunted by threats of violence, in fact, by a sense of the air being thick with fear and danger. Quite a lot of her plays explore the violence of the domestic home. There's the early short play One Good Beating from 1999, which deals with an act of familial revenge. And then there's the later short play for 784, Cold Cuts, from 2005, which anatomizes an act of domestic violence. There's a horrific act of kind of random cruelty that crashes into 2010's Any Given Day. And often, as in Riddance, the violence sort of returns in the form of scars of buried trauma. And you see that too in her heart-rending play, Strangers' Babies from 2007. Riddance also has something which is kind of very characteristic of her work, which is sort of these kind of vertically stacked lines of dialogue, which I suppose could look like she's writing poetry. And certainly they have a kind of crystalline clarity about them. That's something I associate with her writing, that directs attention to language and gives that language a certain kind of stillness and intensity. And in that sense, that there's a kind of connection with poetry. But actually, they're also just really clear notations of force and rhythm that are about strong, vigorous, rich, three-dimensional characters that entirely live on a stage. And for me, what's kind of thrilling and kind of intriguing about Linda's work is what happens when the kind of these two strands come together, which they almost always do, that kind of the omnipresent atmospherics of violence being sort of embodied in this intense broken language. And there's a really interesting kind of tension between the kind of propulsion of the violence and the still intensity of the language. It helps create sometimes a kind of overwhelming sense of horror, people stuck in situations of continual violence and trauma. Sometimes I think it kind of intensifies the naturalism, but sometimes it subtly pulls away from that. She does have a certain kind of naturalist impulse of exploring the lives of people that we don't normally see on stage, of uncovering the terrible secrets and suffering of ordinary life. But the precision of the language and the delicacy of the play structures sort of magnifies the action, making what we're watching seem kind of richer and stranger. And you see that in all her greatest plays, I think. Any Given Day seems like two short plays at first, that you kind of realize at the end that they're connected. But the two halves both depict ordinary lives frozen by fear, battered by suffering, neglect, and loss. But the patterning of the dialogue and kind of the sort of dialectic between the two halves make the stories kind of shimmer achingly. Shimmer, of course, being also the title of one of her plays from 2004. And Shimmer's a play about three women who are all three from three generations, same family, and they're all kind of emotionally frozen in time. Frozen again. That's a kind of interesting image for sometimes how these kind of characters work. And these ones are kind of emotionally frozen by sort of anticipatory grief because the granddaughter is living with a terminal illness, and they're on this probably foolhardy trip to Iona for a kind of magical cure, and they find themselves diverted to a B&B amid endless rain, where they meet three men who are kind of who oddly are echoes of themselves, and the play tells their stories three times, time itself kind of shifting and shimmering, and it slowly allows these characters to move emotionally. It's a play kind of about thawing out, of defrosting and of moving. And that mixture of kind of propulsive movement and then a kind of deeply still timelessness is also there in Sex and God from 2012, which is an honest God masterpiece, I think, which brings together four women from across the 20th century and tells their separate stories, but the language intertwines, the experiences start to overlap, and those teetering towers of text create vivid and extraordinary characters, but also elevates them somehow, creating something that's much more than some of its parts, building, I think, to one of the most inspiring feminist plays I've ever seen. The way the women's identities split and blur into each other is kind of like nothing else. It's very distinctive of Linda's work, actually, a real sense of a continuum of women, a sense that the edges of identity are frayed, that there is something almost metaphysically kind of shared. There are kind of echoes of that elsewhere in the work, in the chorus of Marys in Glory on Earth from 2018, for example. And then actually kind of in the way the plays seem to speak to each other, continuing a longer conversation about suffering and survival, about pain and redemption, of death and life. And now, of course, I'm wondering, I'm worried I'm making the plays sound rather precious, because they're not at all. These plays, sure, they have a kind of refined aspect to them, but they are earthy and they're funny and they're lived. And the title, Sex and God, completely captures that kind of duality. But the earthiness is also kind of there in the language, or in the kind of language's collapse. And these are not plays that are sort of worshipping language in a kind of precious way. One thing that's characteristic of her plays is that the text often seems to kind of collapse into something pre-verbal, something onomatopoeic that I sometimes think feels like it's the body talking. The sexual awakenings of Sex and God, for example, or the impact of a royal procession in Glory on Earth, are represented on the page by a kind of huge, just a very large font, the word boom, and the actions of the action of any given day are interrupted by kind of beep and crack. I say it's pre-verbal, but maybe it's kind of in some ways post-verbal. It's almost as if language builds in intensity to a point where it breaks down and has to mutate into something else. But it's also very funny. Once again, I'm making it sound rather kind of high-minded. It's very funny. She wrote once one of the strangest and most delightful radio plays I've ever heard. It's called Spirit's Sunday Drive. It's from 2004, and it's a dialogue between two items of space hardware exploring the surface of Mars. And their dialogue is a mixture of heartfelt reaching out and the clumsy rattling of their mechanics. So look, if you don't know Linda McLean's work, you should. She's a marvel, and it's a pleasure to introduce her to you. If you know Linda McLean's work, I'm delighted to say, here she is again.
Linda, how lovely to see you.
How lovely to see you.
How are you doing?
Mixed. I think everybody's a bit like that, really.
What is your kind of life like under lockdown?
I'm having to deal with a number of different selves, really.
Right.
You know, there's angry Linda. There's despairing version, creative, which mostly manifests itself in, I think I've got one here somewhere. Mask making.
Oh, yeah. Good.
Yeah, and I have a sense of kind of, there's part of me that's really holding back because from truly feeling the enormity of things. And also even small things like right now, just being able to see you makes me feel a little bit emotional.
Yeah, I know. I think it's kind of partly why I'm doing this series. It's actually getting to talk to people. You know, I mean, I love my wife and my kids, but you know, we're being stuck together all the time is tough, isn't it? You know.
Well, yes, and so there's that other reclusive, Linda, that has to, even though you might imagine you would not need extra time to yourself.
Yeah.
Having to carve out a little space just to not be under anyone's eye.
And are you finding those different selves are conflicting with each other?
I think the one I'm seeing most of is the angry one.
Right. Huh.
But I know that that's partly a compensation for the despairing one because it's easier and it's just a pivot, I think, for me between despair and anger.
When you write,
yeah,
this is a bit of an odd question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, which of those kind of big emotions would you say is closest to you? I mean, would you be somebody who writes when you're angry, or do you need to be more? Can you write when you're despairing? Do you have to be radiantly happy?
The thing that I need most in able to write is to be able to silence the critical voice.
Right.
But mostly when I'm writing, I'm acting all the parts. I'm hearing the voices. And if the voices are angry, I'm totally with it.
Yeah.
And if they're despairing, I'm crying.
Yeah.
And there are occasions when they're doing such awful things that I'm touch typing, and I'm looking away because I can't even bear to look at the screen.
Really? Oh, that's fantastic. and how do you because we all know that critical voice that's telling you how rubbish everything is that you're doing and your life is worthless and all that stuff. How do you silence the critical voice?
Sometimes they're easier than others. The easiest is when I actually feel that I have a flow, then it's irrelevant.
Right.
A really good trick actually that took me years to develop is, when the end of a scene or the end of something that character's doing is in sight, and you're bashing on towards it, I don't go. I stop there.
Right.
And then when I come back, I can get right into it.
Yeah. It's really hard to do that, isn't it? when you
I know, because you want the kind of, oh my God, I did it, joy.
yeah, exactly. What I'd like to do, roughly structuring this, though it's not a very structured conversation, but to start in a more abstract, not abstract way, in a slightly more general way about sort of if there is a typical way in which your plays develop. It'd be quite interesting to talk about that, and then I'd like to talk particularly about Sex and God,
Okay.
just to dig into that towards the end. So in terms of where your plays begin,
Yeah.
is there a sort of a typical trigger that gives you a sense where you think, I think there's a play thought here? Might it be an image, or is it something you've read, or a line of dialogue, or a word, or a feeling? Is there a typical way they start?
I think all of those things are true, but the true start for me is genuinely the half sleeping somewhere between 3 and 5 in the morning, and the dialogue just pops up. And we all have those kind of thoughts at those times in the morning, especially if we don't sleep very well. But I'm talking about the ones where someone says something, or words are said, and your waking brain goes, oh my God, I really want to know what that's about. And I did I did used to get up in the early days and write them down in case I forgot them.
Right.
And then I very quickly realized that my mind is self-protective, and so when I looked in the morning at what I had written down, if I wasn't ready to work on it, it was just nonsense.
Yeah.
So I stopped doing that, and now I only work on the ones that I can remember in the morning.
And that's about kind of trusting that your memory will preserve something that's really got that kind of momentum behind it.
I think, yes, that, but I think more that sometimes I think my subconscious floats things that I'm afraid of, or things that it might be time to deal with.
Right.
And in the morning, I think there's part of me has made the decision as I've gone back to sleep, which is, let's not do that yet. That's right. We have no idea what that was. And, and otherwise it's the oh my God, I'm really onto something, and I start to write as if I'm, as if I have a mission to uncover some secret.
So that's it. That's really interesting. That's very interesting. I'm immediately thinking about your plays and how much sense that makes of how the plays work. But two things I want to kind of just pull out of that. One is you kind of said that you start to kind of feel this dialogue coming, and you want to investigate it.
Yeah.
Does that come with? Is that just language, or is it also a tone of voice? Is there a speaker, even a character attached to that?
There's a speaker, but I'm not always clear what it is. So who it is. So when I start to work on it, when I type those words and then look at them on the screen, I just let them go until the person fleshes around it.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. And does that mean that there's not a period? I mean, some writers, for example, when they get an idea for a play, there might be a period where they will go off and research or carry around a notebook or build. Do you have that, or are you straight into writing dialogue to explore and find out the play?
I think there are different kinds of plays. Right. So Sex and God did not start off like that. For example, Mary Queen of Scots didn't start off like that, but with all of them, the actual writing of the play has to begin in that way.
Okay.
So I, with Glory on Earth and Sex and God, there was a lot of research into, you know, well, with Sex and God, it was the 20th century, the lives of working class women in the west of Scotland in the 20th century.
Right.
Also, I had a kind of collected archive of those stories from women that I knew, you know, my mother-in-law and her family stories, and just, you know, the kind of stories that you collect growing up if you're interested in people and their stories. However, the actual writing of the play didn't start until I heard the voices speak.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. And so when you hear the voices speak, and as you said, so that might happen later in the process or
Yes.
earlier. Is there a kind of day or a moment where you kind of go, I feel that, yeah, today is the day I could start writing this stuff out? Or is it a more gradual emergence? Do you do tentative writing and then go, no, I'm not ready yet?
It's usually right back to the description of the middle of the night. I wait for it. It's almost like, I know it sounds like sleight of hand, but I have to let it creep up on me to have full faith that process, which has always worked before, will work again.
Right.
So it's that, although, as I say with Sex and God, that was different because I heard the voices when I was doing what's the name of the viewpoints exercise, Anne Bogart viewpoint exercise.
Okay.
I was in a workshop. I was facing a corner. I was having to make 4 gestures that somehow linked my body to the space that I was in, and then, you know, abstract that and just link the 4 movements. And I got myself into a kind of Zen space, which was very like the you know, access to the subliminal thing, and the voices just came flooding in, and this had never happened to me before. I ran home because I thought I wasn't going to be able to catch them.
Right, really?
And I've heard people describe that, and that has never before or since been my experience, but that, you know, almost saying, oh, please don't go away, but please don't talk too fast right now because I have to keep up.
Right. And so did you literally go home and immediately start writing?
Yeah. I wrote it in 3 weeks.
That's amazing. I want to hold that thought because I just want to take a little back pedal into the research thing.
Yeah.
When you do research for a play like Sex and God or Mary Queen of Scots or whatever, I'm going to ask a very kind of banal question. What is the research giving you?
Well, I answer this differently now, having researched the lives of John Knox and Mary Queen of Scots, because I would have said that what it was giving me was the grounding, the academic grounding, to be able to hold my own with anyone who would challenge me on the accuracy of the play. And that is true to a certain extent, but it became so much more than that. I think the more research you do, the more it becomes about, especially if there are letters. So John Knox was he wrote thousands of letters. Right. So you begin to hear that voice. And in fact, that was the easiest one to have words for, but the hardest one to make speak, because his writing was formal.
Yes.
Whereas Mary Queen of Scots left nothing in English, almost nothing. And everything that you read about her historically was mostly written by John Knox.
Right. Oh, right.
So I had complete freedom with her voice. And that was a real gift.
Huh. That's that is a gift, isn't it? How extraordinary. I had no idea that was true.
Yeah.
And then, okay, so the writing, when you have had this this waking, sleeping, subliminal moment where you access the voices of the play, at that point you're starting to write. Would you say that's a disciplined process, or let me ask it a different way? Of course, it is a disciplined process in a sense, but what does discipline mean to Linda McLean?
Well, actually, I find it much easier to be disciplined when I'm doing research.
Okay.
Because there are books to read and I'm a good student. Writing the plays that come from nowhere, or whose origins I don't fully know and discover only through the writing. I find that much harder to be disciplined in that. And I have occasionally made myself ill by forcing myself to my keyboard and making myself work. In fact, there was a point about 5 years ago when your body gives you such clues to how you're feeling. I walked into my study and I just turned on my heel and walked back out and thought, I'm never going in there again. Because I couldn't face it. I had pushed myself to a point where my actual work felt toxic.
Right.
So I didn't, and I don't do that anymore. I'm happy I need to move. You know? Yeah. One of the things about this lockdown that I've discovered is I'm not interested in the words inside my head right now. Not in the least. But I'm very interested in learning new skills. So sewing, turns out that sewing machine that I've had in the cupboard actually makes things. Learning how to make face masks. I am now an expert on pressure cookery. Let me recommend it to you. 1 minute pure lentils. Fantastic. Wow. I need to be doing something with my hands, because otherwise I start to I feel a little bit, those polar bears and apes that are in captivity, and you see them, they start pulling
right, yeah,
their hair out and doing weird repetitive behaviors. That was where I was in danger of right. Going. Yeah, that was happening to me. So.
And when you say, you talk about that moment when you walked into your study and turned on your heel and left, and you say that because the work was feeling toxic, that presumably is a different sort of mental resistance from the critical voice that we talked about much earlier. Is that that's a different thing of going, why am I'm not ready to do this yet? And it's a painful process. Is that what it's like?
Yes, I think that was very specific to forcing myself to do something that if I had been listening to myself, particularly to my body, if I'd been listening to myself with a different ear, I would have stopped doing that beforehand. I would have allowed myself to move, to take, time to do other things. I would probably have called the person who gave me the commission and said, I'm really sorry, I just can't do this right now. But I actually do have a very strong work ethic, and I find that kind of thing really hard. I'm better at it now than I was, but right. I have this feeling that if you're not writing plays, you're not actually a playwright.
Right. Okay. Does that mean you're writing most days, or is there a distinct writing phase? And also, are you ever just writing not connected with a particular project, sort of in the way an artist might doodle?
Well, I do occasionally let myself write poetry. That I would never show to anyone, but but weirdly not now. Not at the moment.
Right.
I'm actually finding it difficult even to read new things. I've gone back to reading the books that I grew up with. As though, yeah. There's the child Linda that's looking for some kind of security and safety, and I realised the other day that I've conferred parenthood during lockdown onto Nicola Sturgeon. I watch her daily briefing like someone who's been told, okay, now you're tired, now it's time for bed, and you're going to go to bed and you're going to sleep. And I'm like, okay, Mum.
Yeah, well, you're lucky. We have Daddy Boris.
You know, I can only watch that on certain days. That and I have to be careful, because that's when angry, shouting Linda gets.
Yeah. And so you've kind of described this the process as a bit about sort of following the voices, kind of investigating, trying to find them out. Is that I'm trying to formulate this question. Is that the writing of the play, or is there a sort of period of exploratory writing after which you go, now I think I'm ready to actually sort of write the play that might be seen by the person who's commissioned it, say?
Often it's the first lines of the play,
Right.
but not always.
Right.
Not always, because one of the things that I never used to trust, but which I do now, is that when that dialogue floats up and then I see it on the paper, I know that the play will have an inherent shape. So not something that I will impose upon it, but something that will, and that will evolve, but come almost like fully formed.
Mm. Right.
But I really have to trust that, and if part of trusting it is trusting that those early lines of dialogue to be the key to it.
Yeah. Okay.
However, yeah, sometimes the when you're doing the second draft, you know what the shape is, you know what the character, and you're just trying to get it as sayable as possible for a cast to actually perform it.
Right.
Then obviously you make changes to all of that.
And so the form of the play and the structure of the play is sort of organically emerging as you write out material.
Yeah, and I know that sounds like a bit magical. It's not. I actually know now that there's part of my brain is kind of scoping the world, going, is this useful? Is this useful? Is this useful? But I try not to pay attention to it too much.
Right. You trust that there's a useful technician
Yes.
at work sorting some stuff out for you. That's
very
interesting. So have you ever structured a play before you've written it?
I'm sure I must have in the early days, because in the early days you don't have that faith. But now I'm not sure which. Let me think on that and I'll get back to you.
Well, let me actually ask that in a slightly different way. At the point when you start writing,
yes,
there will be things that you know already, and then there will be things that you very sort of excitedly don't know.
Yeah.
That you want to find out. What kind of things maybe do you know?
That's a much easier question when the play wasn't generated by me, or the idea wasn't generated by me. So for example, in plays that I do research for, as I'm doing the research, I'll be bagsying the ones that, you know, the moments that's definitely going in, and and that's definitely going in.
Yeah.
when I actually start with the early lines of dialogue, I genuinely don't have that.
Right.
You know, I don't know anything.
And when you're writing, this is more nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
Are you handwriting? Are you typing?
Typing.
Typing.
Always. Because I can type with my eyes shut. I don't have to look at the screen.
Right.
And that's also part of the magic for me. It's like I'm not looking at letters, or it has to be able to come through. And I think that's maybe partly the silencing of the critical voice. You know, not being able to see what you're putting on there.
Right.
You know, and often I'm watching, you know, but often I'm not.
Right. And do you mean that literally?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. The end of the first act of any given day, I could not read that as I was writing it. Couldn't.
Right.
Not at all.
And does it feel like, I mean, what you're describing sounds a little bit like you're sort of deliberately accessing a sort of unconscious or something that isn't quite you, that's writing through you. I don't want to make it sound mystical at all, because I agree with you. I know what you mean, and it isn't a mystical process, but it's accessing a part of you don't necessarily have rational control of. Is that how
it's
you
feeling myself that I'm doing that?
Right. Okay. And in terms of actually the way you write, I mean, one of the things I think is very characteristic of just looking at one of your plays, and I'll just sort of show it here if that's visible, is the kind of the vertically stacked dialogue. Do you know what I mean? With the very short lines that you return, and you've always kind of written in that form. What does that do for you? Does that allow a certain freedom? Does it feel more like poetry? I don't know, because it sort of looks more like that on the page. What does that do?
That's the breathing of it. And that came about. The first play that I wrote wasn't written like that at all.
Oh, right.
And actually, coincidentally, it was first read by the writers group at the Nuffield Theatre in Southampton, which sadly has gone into receivership.
Yeah, of course.
It was set in Scotland. There were Scottish voices, but the people who were reading it within the writers group were English, and they couldn't get the rhythm of the language, so it was the oddest thing. I couldn't understand it, and I wrote it.
Right. Okay.
So I came home, and in the time between that meeting and the next one 2 weeks later, I wrote it on the page the way the characters breathed it. So if they hesitated, I take a new line. If they breathe, I take a new line. And they read it. They didn't understand it, but I did.
Right. Okay.
And so I just did that.
And so,
I kept doing that. Yeah.
And does that you'll have had experiences of your plays being done in other accents and other dialects and languages?
Yeah.
Does the breathing pattern and the kind of layout carry on, if you see what I mean, in those other accents?
It was the first time one of my plays was translated into French. It was very difficult. Right. It was fine until it was going to be published, actually. And actors, as far as I'm aware, as far as they've made me aware, they really like it. They like it because the meaning is built into the rhythm. Yeah. It's hard for translators to do, but in France particularly, they couldn't get permission for ages to publish it because the Académie Lingua Française wouldn't allow it to, unless it was standardized. They wouldn't allow it to be published, and then eventually they made concession for theatre, as they do for poetry. So
extraordinary. And this never, I can't believe this had never come up before, but well, obviously not. And then, okay, here's a really, really nerdy nuts and bolts question.
Okay.
Font. When you're typing, what's your font?
Do you think everyone, I do have one actually, but does everyone? Do you think they do?
Well, everyone I've asked, either they have a font that they always use, a couple of people choose a different font for each play.
No, I have one that I use all the time, and it's Helvetica Noi.
Nice, classy, modernist, sans serif.
It's quite Protestant, I think, quite Presbyterian.
Yes. Is that
John Knox, I think, would have approved.
And was that I don't want to go too far into the weeds on this, but was that a sort of conscious choice? You know, that one day you kind of thought, I need to think what kind of how do I want my plays to look on the page, and you chose that, or was it a default?
It's even nerdier than that. I was doing, that handwriting with a thick pen nib, and I was practicing lots of different fonts, and I came across Helvetica Noi, and I went, I really like that.
That's great.
It was that.
And then you touched on this before, but rewriting.
Yeah.
So you, as you say, you said, I think you said you wrote Sex and God in, do you say 3 weeks?
3 weeks, yeah.
Which is relatively fast. So it's coming out in this semi-conscious way.
Yeah.
Is the rewriting a very different type of process? Is that a more technical process, or is that still
that's not a good example, because that was so hard to rewrite, because those voices are all locked into one another.
Yeah.
And the shift in the build up to certain moments, or I mean, the thing that I could never do in that was take a speech and move it.
No.
It was just not possible.
Yeah.
But no, I think that the second draft is, I never enjoy it as much as the first draft, you know. I think one of my character strengths and weaknesses is I love the new thing.
Right.
So that when you talk about discipline, working on the second draft is discipline for me, and I find it satisfying, more or less. But I'm always just a little bit irked that I have to do it. Yeah. And that's about, the first draft typically, I will have sent to someone, the director or someone to read, and they'll be very clear about places where they don't understand what I mean, or that things need fixed. It needs to be, you need to be sure that the things that you want to be understood are understood as well as possible. So,
and that of course makes me think of the opposite. I think from reading, I've read quite a few of your plays, there are always things that I instinctively think you kind of don't want me to understand on some level. Maybe I should understand it on a more subliminal level, but I'm not necessarily, I don't have to lock down exactly who this person is or why they're doing a certain thing. Is that true? Is that how you think of it?
I think I hate plays that explain too much.
Yeah. And
I'm probably guilty of under-explaining, but I kind of trust that if something's there, it's either a clue to me or a clue to you. And if it engages you as a clue, that's fine for me.
Yes. I mean, I suppose the way I would think of it, and this is going to sound like I'm trying to criticize, and I'm absolutely not at all. But I definitely find your plays more difficult to read than some other people's. But I always have this moment, where I was like 3 pages in, I'm going, I really am finding this quite difficult to exactly figure out who's who. But then I always have this moment where this voice says, just go with it. Do you know what I mean? And if you do that and just read it, then it always makes sense. And I genuinely mean, that's not a criticism at all. I think that's kind of one of the joys, that that you kind of, you ask something of your reader. It's not spelt out for you. And that's something I love.
I'm so glad you love it. It doesn't make my work easy to sell, I've been told.
Right.
Yeah. I kind of don't really know how to do those plays any other way.
Yeah. Well, let's.
If it doesn't really engage me, then what am I doing?
Yeah.
I could actually sew things or crochet things, or I'm sure there's other skills out there that would, engage me.
Let's can we talk about Sex and God?
Yeah.
Which is, oh my God, Linda, this is such a beautiful play. God, I read it again yesterday afternoon, and I cried 3 times just reading it, which is, and I've hardly ever cried reading plays. It's an astonishing play. And where did this start?
Actually, this started and halted quite quickly. It started as a conversation with Vicky Featherstone about the idea of writing a historical play about working class women in the west of Scotland, because that was a story that I had never seen or heard really explored.
Mm.
And I went away and thought about it, and I think in the meantime there was never a commission for that directly, but I had a commission to work on, and I started to do the research, and I started to imagine that these women who were composites of lots of women whose stories that I knew, and I started to write it chronologically. Oh my God. It's like, I'd rather not waking up in the morning at all than waking up and do that again.
Right, okay.
It was deathly dull to me to write like that. Yeah. So I did actually say, I can't fulfill this commission. I'm really sorry, and I went away and I left it alone.
Huh.
And then, of course, the stories never go away, and you still have the research. And I didn't know this at the time. I learned such a lot about myself as a writer on that play. And I have to say, if I had gone ahead with the commission, it would have been a dreadful play. I'd have been embarrassed by it.
Right.
And it was years. I mean, really, like 4 or 5 years between that thought and that research, and standing at dance space in Edinburgh, facing a corner, making gestures with my arms, and the voices came tumbling out. So it was years between the point at thinking that was a play worth doing and actually having access to those voices. And I think it was really no coincidence that I was making 4 gestures and then tied the 4 gestures together in one unified gesture and just did that for half an hour. That resulted in that completely tied together vocal, whatever that was. I don't even know what to call it, but yeah.
I mean, had the play been on your mind, or was this a real rising up from the depths?
Oh, no, completely. I was like, yeah, that's never happening.
Right. Okay. How fascinating. Does that happen? Has that happened? Has it happened to you before that a play has had that length of sort of gestation?
I didn't know it, but yes, I do know that that's true now. Yeah, I think Any Given Day was probably working away in my gut, in my mind, somewhere for 10 years probably.
Right.
Castle Lennox, which should have opened last weekend,
Oh no.
is another one that I've been carrying with me since I was about 7 years old. So
I didn't know this. I'm so sorry. I should have known this. Where was Castle Lennox supposed to open?
At the Lyceum.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh man. Is that well, we don't know, do we? We don't know what's going to happen to theatre.
We're calling it postponed at the moment.
We're calling it postponed. Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure it is just postponed. So you did this research phase quite a long time before writing the play.
Yeah.
Did you go back to the research?
Only when I wanted to be sure about the period, the setting.
Yeah.
It became important to me to understand what people would have been wearing, for example.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the actual jobs that they would have been doing, and who might have been employing them. And
that's really interesting. So does that mean that the main 4 women,
yeah,
Jane, Lizzie, Sally and Fiona, that you had a very clear sense of their lives and biographies, and exactly when, for example, those stories are sort of set?
Within rough periods. I wouldn't like to tie it down to a specific date, but certainly a specific decade, yes.
Right. Okay.
And I knew what else was happening in the world at those times.
Right. Okay. And so did you, when you kind of started writing, did you kind of know what their stories were all going to be, or was that very exploratory?
I had rough ideas, like I knew what all their professions were.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
They constantly surprised me by how they described things, and there were some things that happened obviously a lot of it was made up, but there were stories that I had heard that I used, that they told it, within the play.
And of course, I mean, it's interesting that obviously it's a play about working class women in the west of Scotland. Their work is a very important strand in it, but I mean, actually, sort of sex becomes this extraordinary thing, and actually something that ties them together. Was that a discovery, or was that actually part of the research? Because obviously there's the babies sort of issue about kind of working class life, but how did that emerge?
I didn't know that was emerging, and I didn't know that the play was called Sex and God until after I'd written it.
Really?
The story about it being Sex and God was, I was sitting at the kitchen table with my son, and I was saying, I have no idea what to call this play. And he said, well, Mum, what's it about? And I went, Sex and God. And he went, that's a great title.
Well, it is.
I was like, surely somebody's called something Sex and God before. I couldn't find it, so that stuck. But yeah, I was aware when I was writing it that, this is funny, I just remembered this, that it was one of these moments where I had to overcome my own Presbyterian nature to write sex.
Oh, really?
It was a look away moment. It was a, oh, for God's sake, people are watching.
Right, that's interesting. Because that is so pivotal. I mean, the boom of the play, it is such a sort of, I don't want to say climactic, but, you know, it's a sort of, it is such a kind of key.
Yeah.
And then, because just thinking about how the way you described your first attempt to write it, you know, in the sort of late 2000s, I guess, where it was a bit more sequential and it sounds a bit more, almost more documentary-ish. Obviously, the thing that, for people who haven't seen this play, the thing that is sort of the formal conceit of the play is you have these four women from four different periods, but they are in their separate periods, but they're also speaking together and they overlap, and they speak in unison sometimes, and then they diverge sometimes, and so on. Did that whole sort of idea emerge in the corner doing the viewpoints?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. But I do know that round about, when did Tate Modern open? Like around about 2000, something like that. I went to see the Cornelia Parker exhibition, and she had a blown up shed. I think it was exploded shed, something like that. Anyway, the thing that mesmerized me about that, and I clearly logged that was one of the ones that I bagged. The thing I loved about it was the invisibility of the strings that were holding them together. And I know that in the writing of Sex and God, that's that. If I could say that was an inspirational shape for that, without that being at the front of my mind, I know that that was one of the things that I had bagged.
Huh. And I want to kind of pursue that actually, but I want to ask a slightly more, I suppose, a more technical thing, which is about the relationship, I guess, between sort of abstraction and concreteness. Because one of the things I really admired when I was reading it again yesterday was that on one level, of course, there is an abstraction in the sense that you know, there are these voices sort of coming out of nowhere in there, and we get glimmers of the world around them, but in a sense it's the voice, and even though you know things about where they work and so on, that you don't give us all of that. So there's a certain level of abstraction, but yet moment by moment it feels like we're absolutely in a situation. Do you know what I mean? So it doesn't just become floaty poetic words. Do you know what I mean? Are you sort of conscious as you write that? It seems to me that's one of the things that makes it, you know, completely a theatre piece rather than a piece of spoken word, or do you know what I mean? Is that something you sort of, you're conscious of, that you correct for, that you're digging into the research to find those moments of concreteness, or is that just pure instinct?
Can I ask you a little bit about what you mean specifically about the concreteness? You mean like context, their individual context, or their shared context, or?
I think it's probably, what do I mean by that? I suppose I think I mean that when people are talking about feelings and thoughts, that can feel quite ethereal. But it seems to me there are so many moments. For example, Fiona's, she has quite a long speech about being sort of nearly run over by a car, and the whole way the driver is initially extremely apologetic and panicky, and then is quite abusive as he drives away. It seems to me, though, there are lots of those moments, and not as huge as that, but there are lots of moments where it really grounds the thing in a very sort of robust sense of recognizable experience.
I needed to know exactly where they were in Glasgow when they were saying those things.
Okay.
So I needed to know the street the flat, and I had those pictures that I was very rooted in that. Yeah.
Okay. And knowing that stuff, do you think just sort of gives it a concreteness because it's very placed in your head?
Do you know, I for better or worse, I have to confess, I did not think about that.
That's totally fine. That's totally fine. And it's also good to know when the things that people don't think about. And then again, you can tell me you don't want to talk about any of these things, but I was interested in the boom because actually it's something that I think that you've done in a few plays. There are these moments where almost the form of the play breaks apart, and then we just get sort of onomatopoeic words or, you know, whatever it is. Do those surprise you? Or do you actually kind of think, I think there's that moment coming, or something else?
They're always addressing a feeling that I have.
Yeah.
That's visceral. And I include sexual in terms of visceral.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah, and that one, I didn't know that I was writing about this, and it's not actually mentioned in the play, but I was in Kenya, and at midnight on a New Year, I left the Norfolk Hotel as it exploded behind me. It was blown up by terrorists, and a passerby saved my life. There was a wall crumbling just behind me.
Right.
And that I don't even know how to describe what that feels like in your body, but it just always felt like boom to me.
Yeah.
And so there are feelings and situations that make me aware that I am feeling that boom type feeling. So,
Right.
so that's what that's actually about.
And of course, something a bit like that happens to Fiona in the play, getting off a...
Yes, it's set in Israel. She comes off a bus and it's blown up. But yeah.
Huh. Wow. And then I want to ask a question that is probably a stupid question to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I wonder whether, I wonder how far you think that the kind of form of your plays and the kind of interesting shiftingness of them is a particularly female form. I'm going to ask it as blandly and bluntly as that.
I think it's female in the sense that I discovered, someone pointed out to me that I mostly write about women on the margins, women that most other people don't write about, and so in that way I would say yes. I don't know about what do you think?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I suppose sort of intellectually, I'm familiar with arguments that sort of talk about sort of that linearity might be a particularly kind of male form, and rising to a single climax, you know, those sorts of ideas. Whereas, you know, the fact that I was interested in the, you know, of course, here you have 4 women in different time periods who are also in sort of somehow magically in the same time period because they're somehow connecting with each other, which of course makes me think of the first scene of Top Girls by Carol Churchill, or the wasteland scenes in My Mother Said I Never Should by Charlotte Keatley, and both of those plays, I think there's a clear sense that the sort of thing they were trying to capture something about women's experience. But that's a very intellectual thought. I feel reading them a very strong sense that this is does not feel like a male way of seeing the world. I can't really explain that thought very much more than that, but I suppose I intuitively ask that question anyway.
I think women are really good at listening, you know, like a lot of, and being observant, you know, like down to small detail. And so I've often heard people say women are great at dialogue. And I actually think that that's probably that women are good at listening. I don't know if men are not good at listening. I'm sure there are some men who are better at listening than others, obviously. It's very thought-provoking, actually. I mean, I know that I think I can trace the fact that I'm observant back to the fact that I grew up in a violent household where violence was random. It wasn't causal. You were never hurt for doing something wrong. You were hurt because someone was being violent for some unpredictable reason. And so therefore your response, I mean, people have various responses to that, but I know that mine, even as a child, a very young child, was to try and pay very close attention to the triggers that might lead to that. So there was never this thing happened, and then there was this moment of violence. It's these little fragments, this change of tone, or the way the door slammed, or someone says something ill-considered. Any of those could lead to the outburst of violence. And so therefore I know that I was looking at fragments of moments. I wasn't looking at a linear progression.
That makes that's really, gosh, that's fascinating. I've got a last question. And the last question is that I guess you've been writing plays for 20
years.
Yes. Wow. What have you learnt? What do you feel you know how to do now that perhaps 20 years ago you wouldn't have been so confident about?
In terms of writing plays?
Yes.
To absolutely just go with where the voices take me and not be afraid. Brilliant.
Linda, how lovely to see you.
I know, and you too. I want to lean forward and give you a wee kiss.
Well, look, hopefully, once this lockdown is over, it'll be lovely to see you again. So, but thank you so much for your time. So generous. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.